Hello and welcome to Follow the Money. I am Su Jin Kim. Join us as we explore the tools and insights you need to jumpstart your financial journey. As the 2025 Philippine midterm elections draws to a close, the nation's economy arrives at a critical juncture. GDP growth figures are touted as signs of recovery and progress, but are they translating into real gains for ordinary Filipinos? Joining us today is Senior Research Fellow of the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, Dr. Paolo Rivera. Welcome to Follow the Money, Dr. Rivera.
Hey, good afternoon, and thank you for having me here.
It's great to see you again. Paolo, let's jump in straight to the questions. Much has been said about the election spending effect on a domestic consumption-driven economy. Do the numbers really bear this out?
Well, yes, because historically, during an election year, the consumption in the Philippines is actually surging, particularly household consumption and services output, particularly in the industries of retail, transportation, even media. However, this surge in the economy is quite temporary because after the election period, things would normalize again, and this growth that we are experiencing right now is just a sudden surge, which can be tempered by the end of the year.
And then, Paolo, we're 2 days past the 2025 midterm elections. Based on how the markets and public sentiment are moving, what's the immediate post-election pulse check on the Philippine economy?
Well, so far, observing the macroeconomic figures and the dashboard, there seems to be no panic and no violent reaction towards the election results. So the market is behaving muted and normal. And this is because of the expectations towards the recent election results. While there are newcomers in the top 12, this is being welcomed by the market on a positive note. That's why the behavior is quite stable as of the moment.
And then, do businesses tend to accelerate or delay investments during election periods in the Philippines? And how does this political uncertainty play into economic activity?
Well, the behavior of the firms would depend according to their size. For example, bigger firms would tend to delay their capital expenditures depending on how they feel about the election results. So it's some sort of a wait-and-see scenario. However, for smaller firms like MSMEs, they tend to benefit more from this election spending, so they have more the funds. They're more liquid during this time to be able to venture into other productive business activities.
And then, how do capital markets typically react during election years here? Are there any notable patterns?
Well, during election years, usually the market behaves volatile. Volatility would increase because of the expectations towards the election results. However, during this counting period, investors would tend to have, or the market participants would tend to have a wait-and-see attitude depending on who would really win, if their preferred candidates would win. So unless the election results have been certified and all the winners have been confirmed, then we can now determine what will be the most likely reaction of the market as a result of the election results.
And then, are there specific sectors you expect to either rally or retreat in the short term as a result of the midterm polls? Maybe, let's say, retail or energy or infrastructure?
Well, those who would rally would be the traditional production and services-oriented industry because they're not really that exposed to the changes in administration, changes in legislation. However, those industries that are highly regulated, as we have mentioned, like energy, they would be more cautious because of the unexpected turn of events after the election results and once the winners have been proclaimed, because the policy uncertainty would now come into the picture.
And then, since election spending has been described as a sugar rush for the economy, how soon do you expect that stimulus effect to fade?
Well, historically speaking, looking at data, every election year we experience this surge in the first quarter and second quarter and would suddenly slow down in the third and fourth quarter.
What causes this slowdown?
Well, the slowdown would come from the fact that spending is now normalizing. The households are not anymore spending on any election-related activities, and the economy is actually returning to its previous behavior prior to the election season. And that normalization would really cause a sudden slowdown in the third and fourth quarter GDP figures, which is expected. That's why it is very important that the election season be reinforced with productive economic activities by those who won.
But then first quarter GDP didn't exactly reflect bigger growth because of the elections. How would you explain that? Was there a growth because of the elections in the first place?
Well, the election season actually given a brief surge to that contribution to that economic growth, but it is not enough as we expected it because of a lot of other factors. Like for example, even if consumption has increased, our investment spending, the inflow of investments, the productivity of other sectors like agriculture was not able to contribute much to that growth. And that's why we cannot just rely on the election spending stimulus to be able to boost the economy because other potential sectors were not able to deliver during the first quarter.
You mentioned agriculture in particular. Why was that?
Well, traditionally, agriculture has been lagging in terms of contribution because a lot of, for example, investments are going to manufacturing and services, making the agriculture left behind. That's why we've been calling for more stimulus, more assistance, and more funding to the agriculture sector so that it can contribute more to GDP as well, no, as important as how the manufacturing and services sector are contributing.
How big was the contribution of manufacturing and services sectors in our GDP for Q1?
Well, for the first quarter, I may not have the exact figures right now, but it is quite significant that relative to the contribution of agriculture is really lagging behind because of the fact that there's a lack of productivity, because a lot of, for example, workers, investors, the output are more concentrated to the other sectors because the Philippines is quite leaving its agricultural roots because of the lack of investments.
But do you think we have to spur the manufacturing in the country still?
Well, we have to give equal importance to these three sectors. I mean, that's how I see it because I'll take the case of the pandemic. During the pandemic, the services sector actually contracted, the manufacturing sector contracted, except the agriculture sector. And that gives us a signal that we should also give due importance to the agricultural sector in the same way that we're giving importance to manufacturing and services.
And how do we reconcile the difference? Because food inflation has been easing, but you mentioned we still have a problem with agriculture. How do we reconcile that disparity?
Well, the inflationary component of the agricultural sector is stemming from the fact that the Philippines is not producing that much, but we are able to address it through temporary importation so that we can temper the inflation driven by food. But then this is the reason why the importation would have to be managed as well because we might be importing inflation.
And then going back to the topic of elections, if you were to flag one insight that most analysts are missing about post-election economics, what would that be?
Well, maybe it's more of the appointments that are being done by new local government leaders, particularly in the local government, because there are certain positions that require a plantilla position, but because of the change in leadership in the local government every 3 years, they tend to be replaced. And in the local government, continuity is really key. So I would like to emphasize here that the risk of having a new leadership in the local government would require that these new leaders would have to keep in mind continuity by keeping those who are working in particular positions fixed.
You mentioned continuity is key, especially in local government units. Is it true, especially for provinces that host industrial zones, ports, and let's say major infrastructure? Why is it important to sustain private sector confidence? Or why is that important to sustain private sector confidence?
Private sector confidence is mostly driven by policy continuity. The private sector would be more willing to funnel in funds to a particular investment, to a particular government agency, to a particular industry, if they are sure that there is no erratic change in policy, they can mitigate volatility, and this can only be done if leaders would be able to project that, hey, there will be continuity even if I am the new leader in this local government.
Is there a credible way, do you think, to measure how much LGU leadership affects local economic development beyond the anecdotal evidence?
Well, we can look at let's say the provincial product accounts on how this leadership was able to stimulate growth, investments in a particular local government unit. I would still continue to rely on the productivity statistics, the productivity figures that we have at the provincial, even at the regional level, to represent. Well, there are a lot of representation that can be done, but so far what we have right now in the Philippines would be the productivity of a particular local government unit in terms of economic contribution.
Are you personally still hopeful? Do you expect the new set of elected officials, especially governors and mayors, to significantly influence ease of doing business in their areas?
Well, The local government would also be contributing to the goal of the Philippines to become an upper middle income country. And this can be done by a managed growth for every local government. And the ease of doing business would actually attract investments all over the country because investors would see this policy continuity and would also make sure that, hey, I'm putting in money here, so it should be worth it, and it's a measure of worthiness if I'm able to maneuver, no? If investors can maneuver the different bureaucratic processes that's happening at the local government.
You mentioned achieving upper middle income country. And if I'm not mistaken, DepDev has the target of achieving this by next year, 2026. Do you think that's possible?
Well, I am an optimistic forecaster, and we still have the second, third, and fourth quarter to be able to beef up our growth figures. However, it may be tough given the first quarter figure, but there is still a way. And the way towards that upper middle income country status, the way to the required GDP growth rate to achieve that, would rest on how productive our newly elected leaders would be able to stimulate the economy, if they would be launching programs, activities, and projects that would create this multiplier effect to achieve that at least 6% growth rate for the rest of the year.
So Paolo, what's missing? What are we lacking? Why aren't we achieving the upper middle income country status yet?
Well, the upper middle income is measured on the basis of per capita income. It might be the case that our population is actually growing faster than how we grow the economy. That's why one of the strategies that government can do is to actually ensure that our economic growth is growing faster than our population. And this can be done through productive activities, better legislation, and our leaders working together with good programs, with good projects that will boost the economy.
If you were to be asked, what were the top 3 things we can implement to boost productivity, what would it be?
Well, number 1 would be infrastructure. The Philippines would have to continuously catch up on the infrastructure level and sophistication with respect to our neighboring economies. Number 2, as what I have mentioned earlier, is the stimulation of growth in the agricultural sector. And then number 3, of course, we should not also forget the other sectors, giving them equal importance, services and manufacturing where the Philippines can actually benefit by allowing them to grow further through investments.
And then talking about the elections again, what should Filipino consumers, workers, and MSMEs realistically expect in the next 6 to 12 months now that elections are over?
Okay, now that elections are over, consumers, households, MSMEs can actually expect moderate growth. And this moderate growth is stemming from the fact that there are a lot of domestic and foreign uncertainties going on right now, particularly in the foreign market. And this moderation in growth can be averted if our newly elected leaders would have new programs that would allow the local economy to have a reduced risk and better programs for economic growth.
And then midterms are often seen as the halfway mark. From a development lens, is the Philippines on track to meet its long-term economic goals?
Yes, we are. No? I've always believed that the Philippines is always on track, but it is conditional. Conditional on how leaders view the economy, conditional on what the country prioritizes, would it be the economics of things, would it be the infrastructure development, or would it be the noises that we have to manage throughout the country?
And then where do you think the government has under-delivered most so far in terms of structural reforms? And can that realistically be corrected in the next 3 years?
Well, over the past years, the government has been very conscious about the ease of doing business. In fact, in recent years, we have actually relaxed some of the constitutional constraints that limits investment entry into the Philippines, and we have been making strides on that. However, there's still opportunity for the Philippines to actually improve on the implementation of these new amendments, or the relaxation of constitutional constraints to investments. Because the relaxation is there, the implementation, more opportunity to work better on that.
There's definitely more room for structural reforms. And we are just getting started. Follow the Money returns after a short break.
Welcome to Lifeline, your ultimate guide to bridging the gap between where you are and where you want to be. Today, our guest stands as Congresswoman Geraldine Roman, the first transgender lawmaker in Philippine history.
My father was very supportive, made me feel important and loved. Consider yourselves to be unique. And you know that's what makes you special. Basta may ka nananakit ng ibang tao, push mo lang yan.
Attorney Karen Jimeno at the forefront. 9 a.m. on BNC, the Bilyonaryo News Channel.
Good evening, I'm Pinky Webb.
The questions,
What did you uncover?
Nakita natin yung sa IPO, there was a violation of Section 8 of Republic Act 9511.
the issues.
Is there a problem with that, the present setup of the syntax?
The reason there's a 5% increase is because of inflation.
We clarify matters.
All these government agencies were actually at the lowest. That's why it has to be, I hope that it will be addressed.
Pinky Webb is always on point.
Welcome back to Follow the Money. We're still unpacking matters relating to GDP growth and the midterm elections with Dr. JP Rivera of the Philippine Institute for Development Studies. Now, JP, latest data from the Bangko Sentral showed FDIs are down to $500 million in February. Do you expect foreign investors to become more aggressive or cautious in the aftermath of the elections? And what signals could they be watching out for?
Well, first of all, I would like to talk about the signals first. Foreign investors are actually looking at number one, policy continuity, policy stability, ease of doing business, and government efforts towards fighting corruption, increasing the ease of doing business, and managing relevant issues like money laundering and so on. So, given these post-election results, investors would actually look out for this one, and our new leaders would have to watch out for all of these expectations by investors so that we can attract them and they can contribute to the investment spending in the country.
We've made a lot of progress in terms of bumping up our ratings by international credit watchers. Do you think that's enough? And what else do we have to do?
Well, the credit ratings is actually a positive development. We welcome that development, but it has to be reinforced by other factors or other strategies by government and private sector, and that is towards creating a more conducive investment environment through better labor, less corruption, less bureaucratic processes. Technically, we have to make the doing business in the country easier, seamless through the adoption of technology.
You touched on labor with your answer. The wage hike discourse is back, and with several pro-labor candidates winning, are you expecting stronger pressure on the wage boards and DOLE to act? And what are the implications of this?
Well, I would like to take this one from a private sector lens. The wage hike might be taken from a calibrated perspective because we have to know as well whether the private sector can actually handle this wage hike. It's easy to ask for a wage hike, but we always have to be conscious whether there are necessary resources or about the capabilities of our private sector to deliver it, given a lot of constraints that's happening right now.
And do you think realistically the private sector will be able to handle a wage hike right now?
The private sector would be able to handle it, but it would depend on the industry, on their profitability, on the performance of their financials. It would be on a case-to-case basis. That's why I value the consultation with private sector as well with respect to wage hikes, because it has to be on a two-way street. You cannot just request it and then the private sector would not be able to give it. We will just be frustrated by it.
That's definitely true. Consultations are important. And what should the government prioritize more at this stage? Do you think it's expanding revenues or protecting household consumption? And how do you balance all of that, you think?
I think it's more of creating more revenues for the government without the need for additional taxes. And that can be done through proper management of taxes, proper spending, accountability, and good governance. We do not need additional taxes right now given the situation of our consumers with the high interest rates, although inflation is slowing down, but prices are not really going down. It's just that the increase of prices is actually slowing down. So we need to have a more responsive policy that will allow consumers, households, even the private sector to maneuver the recent developments in the economy.
what are other non-tax revenues that we can focus on?
Well, non-tax revenues, I think it's more of a streamlined collection of taxes.
And then the BIR has done a good job, would you say? Has the BIR done a good job in enhancing their revenue collection system because they were able to hit a record high with their collections just last year?
Yeah, we would have to give credit to BIR for making progress in improving tax collection. But the thing that we have to manage would be unnecessary leakages from the budget, because these leakages are not being turned into productive activities, but rather they're just simply leakages that do not contribute to economic growth. So more than managing revenue growth, we also have to manage the leakages that is happening in the budgetary system.
That's true. And then finally, if you had a minute with the economic team and the president post-elections, what would be your recommendation or your message to guide them through the second half of the term?
Well, I would love to have that opportunity, but the one that I would say to them is, number one, focus on the job. Let's reduce the noise that's going on in the national government and focus on what will allow us to meet the necessary growth figures to achieve upper middle income status.
We're excited to meet the upper middle income country status. And then for our last question, given the situation in the Philippines, the inflation is low even though the GDP figures failed to meet the government's target. Do you think the BSP will be able to decouple to the Federal Reserves?
Well, not totally, but what we can do here is to focus on the internal environment in the Philippines, because that's the only thing we can control. We cannot control the behavior of the Federal Reserve, but we can control the inflation here, we can control the behavior of our macro indicators, and that should be good enough for us to be able to at least mitigate whatever negative impacts the external economy would bring to the Philippines.
Thank you so much for your insights. And that's a wrap for Follow the Money. We thank PIDS Senior Research Fellow, Dr. John Paolo Rivera, for shedding light on the economic undercurrents shaping our democracy. Before we go, a reminder from former NEDA Socioeconomic Planning Secretary, Dr. Ernesto Pernia. The challenge is to make this growth inclusive so that more people contribute to and benefit from it. And that's it for today's edition of Follow the Money. I am Su Jin Kim. Thanks for watching. Keep it here on BNC, the Bilyonaryo News Channel, always on top.